All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sam. This is our first Oxford Net Zero and Skoll Center conversation. So glad to be having it with you. Sam, I wondered if you could I could ask you the first question, which is about how you became involved in this climate work. And maybe a little bit of something about your journey that maybe we wouldn't otherwise see on a CV or on a bio.
Yeah, the thing you can see on my CV is that I have done climate change for an embarrassingly long period of time. We have to go back to the year 1990, when I was looking for a topic to write my PhD on. I was trained in economics at LSE. I knew I wanted to do environmental economics at UCL, so I was changing college. That's roughly all I knew, environmental economics. That's what I wanted to do. So my supervisor gave me this brand new report from an organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had just issued its first ever report. He gave it to me and sort of said, look at this, might be interesting. And I looked at it, found it interesting, and haven't looked back in a sense.
Well, that's so great. I mean, and I feel like we're probably all going to be looking out for the next IPCC report. I think it's coming out in August, if I'm not mistaken. So it'll be interesting to see what's in these sort of follow-on reports. Could I ask you a little bit about some of the questions that you're exploring in your research right now, Sam? What are sort of some of the questions that you're finding really interesting to tuck into at the moment?
Yeah, I'm sort of continuing on my journey, if that's permissible. My first climate change interests were in the impacts of climate change. And having sort of figured out that if you do the impacts, you have to study adaptation, because the impacts is a function of how much you can adapt to those impacts. So I moved from impacts to adaptation, and then that sort of led me to probably limits to adaptation. So I got into the emissions reductions side, first via carbon trading, and then more generically about emission reductions. And the latest thing I do with Oxford Net Zero is sort of almost like a logical endpoint of that journey, because Oxford Net Zero is interested in two things, or net zero is about two things. One is the net, that's the negative emissions that we might need to offset whatever we can't avoid anymore. And the other is the zero, that's sort of dealing with the difficult emissions that we still have ahead of us to reduce. You know, a lot of the conversation so far has been about renewable energy, energy efficiency. And there was sort of a perception that if you've done that, you've solved the problem, but that's not actually true. We now have to start looking at difficult things in inverted commas, industrial emissions, agricultural emissions, land use emissions. So what I'm currently doing with Oxford Net Zero is those difficult emissions and the policy instruments, the incentives that we need to bring those difficult emissions down, but then also the policy incentives to make the negative emissions, the offsets, happen.
Great. Okay. And I feel like if people want to learn more about some of your work, I know that there's quite a few links through the Oxford Net Zero website, and people can follow and see you in action with some great videos I know you've done recently. Can I ask, one of the topics that is a key sort of area of focus at the Skoll Center is about economic justice. So there is sort of a research vertical looking at this concept of justice from an economic perspective. I wonder how that is reflected in some of the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, I think justice is a big part of the puzzle, and net zero to work has to be perceived to be just, and people have to be comfortable with it. So there's actually one of the Oxford Net Zero fellows explicitly, her job description is net zero climate justice. There are various aspects to climate justice, actually. What people usually understand, and what my colleague Jessica does, is justice between countries. You know, the rich countries like the UK, which have emitted a lot and probably not going to suffer quite as much as some of the poor countries who haven't emitted a lot, but will be at the sort of the receiving end of the worst impacts. So there's justice between countries, who does how much and who gets compensated how much. But there's also justice for people. Some of the climate solutions, you know, will be bad for poor people. Energy prices might temporarily go up. So there's justice to deal with that. we have to worry about some of the workers. So there's justice for people who currently work in high carbon jobs, for no faults of their own. How can we transition them in a just, fair and easy, non-disruptive way from high carbon jobs and low carbon jobs? And finally, the fourth thing is justice to future generations. That's in a sense why we are doing that. We want to preserve the planet for future generations. So there's at least 4 justice elements between countries, consumers, workers, and future generations.
Well, that's so great. And I'm really pleased you also mentioned Jessica's work, because Jessica will also be one of the people we'll be interviewing as part of this sort of Oxford Net Zero and Skoll Center series. So we will be able to sort of double click a little bit more on climate justice when we speak to Jessica. But thank you. Now I've got sort of 2 more questions for you, actually. The first one is about sort of the research you're doing and the work that you're focused on. How would you like to see this put in practice by business? What are the sorts of things that businesses could do?
Well, business is obviously a big part of the solution, partly because they're a big part of the problem as well, because a lot of the emissions do have sort of business or industrial origins. So part of the solutions is businesses starting to manage their emissions, but businesses are also good at innovation. Businesses are good at investment. So businesses will be the ones that have to sort of build the zero carbon capital stock and devise the zero carbon solutions. So that's what we look for business too. And in a sense, businesses are starting to get that, which is actually quite refreshing. Sort of going back to my journey, I sort of have quite the low bar, but in the early days of doing climate change, I had to explain that climate change wasn't about changing the investment climate, and environmental economics wasn't about the business environment. I no longer have to do that. People know what climate change is. You can throw jargon around like COP26, Paris Agreement, net zero, and people know what it is. So that's brilliant. And sort of businesses have to start building on that knowledge and become serious about their commitments to bring down their own emissions.
So I'm going to throw in a question. It's a bit of a wild card one, but just hearing you speak about the sort of transition and how things have been moving over the years, I guess I'd love to hear if there was sort of one business or one industry that you would really like to work with and apply some of the research you do. Is there a business in particular or an industry that you feel like you'd really like to sort of spend time, getting into and making sure they're sort of understanding the dynamics that you spend your time looking at in your research?
That's a very good question. I mean, historically, my interest has mostly been in development finance. So the industry, if that's the word for it, that I'm most familiar with is development finance institutions, the World Bank, IFC, EBRD, the CDC, the UK's development finance institutions, which have a huge part to play because they have to finance and support the decarbonisation in middle and low income countries. So that's in a sense the industry I know best, which has a huge part to play. I'm developing interest in the industry that will have to deliver the negative emissions, the net in net zero, and that industry is only emerging, and it's fascinating because it isn't just companies doing storage or companies doing sequestration. There will be a whole sort of industrial ecosystem that has to emerge: support systems, measurement systems, quality assurance systems, consulting, transport will be part of that, finance will be part of that. We have to build that entire new industry with all its sort of supporting parts, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to be super interesting to see as your work evolves and we see all the change that's happening at the wider systems level, where and how these things work together and help us all move faster with higher levels of ambition to truly address these challenges that we're facing right now. Okay, one last question, because I just can't help it. But we're obviously both at Oxford, and Oxford is a place with incredible, deep, amazing research facilities. And it's a place where young people come to learn, to share, to get inspired. Any words of advice for young people that are at Oxford studying right now, anywhere across the university? Is there anything you'd want to pass along to them in terms of advice for their time?
Well, I'm new to Oxford myself, so most of the students will have been there longer than I have. But advice to young people, to students, it's interesting. I used to say to young people when they asked me, "What can you do about climate change?" I used to say, "Be noisy, make your point, tell people what needs to be done, make the point for future generations." Turns out they've already done that now, so I have to find a new recommendation. And the new recommendation, I guess, is to start change the system from within. So studying climate change, to develop the skills, the domain knowledge, the techniques that you need to do emission reductions, to do sustainability. Learn that at university, learn it well, then go up, join companies that are in that space, or even companies that should be and aren't yet, and start changing them from within.
I love it. And maybe still be noisy as well, right?
And be noisy as well. Yes, don't switch off the noise.
Excellent. Well, thank you for our wonderful little Oxford Net Zero Skoll Center chat, Sam. Really appreciate your time. And I know others are going to have probably a lot of further questions. So what I would say is to anyone who's interested in some of the things we've chatted about today, definitely head on over to the Oxford Net Zero website. Thanks again, Sam, and I hope you have a great Friday.
Thanks, Char, and lovely conversation.